Good day viewers, today I am going to discuss about the lymphatic system. So mainly the objectives of today's session will be about introduction to lymphatic system, understanding what lymphatic system is, components or parts which constitutes the lymphatic system, the general features or characters of the lymph vessels. Then we will discuss about the characters of central lymphoid tissues and peripheral lymphoid tissues. Then about certain applied aspects. Now first of all, what is actually a lymphoid or lymphatic system? So it is something accessory to venous system, because venous system is actually responsible for the collection of the used up blood from the tissues. The same way, the lymphatic system also can be considered as an offshoot of the venous system, which is responsible for collecting the waste materials. So 10 to 20% of the tissue fluid actually passes through the lymphatic system. So whatever the tissue fluid which we see at the arterial end of the capillaries, the same amount 100% does not reach to the venous end of the capillaries. Only 80% is actually reaching the venous end of the capillaries. The remaining 20 to 20% from the tissue spaces is actually collected by the lymphatic system. But ultimately what happens is, whatever is collected by the lymphatic system has to be again submitted to the venous system. So mainly it is involved in the drainage of large particulate matter. That means it is a drainage of coarse system. Coarse or larger particles, so larger protein molecules can actually be drained by this lymphatic system, whereas venous system is considered as a drainage system of finer particles. Not only that, it is also involved in the phagocytosis. So phagocytosis of toxic materials, proteins, which is unwanted by the body, or microbes like virus, bacteria and so on. But the reticuloendothelial system is or does not fall strictly under the lymphatic system. We will come to it later. Then it is also very much responsible for the immune responses exhibited by the lymphatic system. So mainly involved in the immune responses. The vessels of the lymphatic system is actually called as lymphatics, and what flows within these vessels are actually called as lymph. So it's a colorless fluid, usually not visible. Even the lymph vessels are actually not visible to the naked eye. Only in certain large vessels you can see some capillary plexus on the surface, so which gives red streaks on the surface. Through that we can identify the lymph vessels. The only lymph vessel which can be identified through our naked eye, which can be recognized through our naked eye, is the thoracic duct, which I will be speaking about it after a couple of slides. So and the lymph, which is collected from all the tissue spaces, is actually colorless, whereas the lymph from the intestine is actually milky white, and it is actually called as chyle, and especially it is very much milky white when we take a high fat diet. When our diet is composed of lot of fat materials, and naturally you can see it is much milky, and these lymph vessels, when they possess this chyle, can be also a little bit easily recognized in the mesentery. And the lymph vessels from the intestine, they are not called as lymphatics, and instead they are actually called as lacteals. Okay. So, to summarize, basically lymphatic system is a accessory to the venous system, mainly involved in the drainage of large molecules or coarser type of molecules through their vessels. Concerned with immune responses, the vessels are usually not visible because they possess colorless fluid. Lymphatics of the intestine are actually called as lacteals. Now coming to the components of the lymphatic system. So mainly it comprises of lymph vessels, then tissue, specific tissues which consist of these cells. They are mainly central lymphoid tissue and peripheral lymphoid tissue. Then circulating lymphocytes, so they are freely circulating in our bloodstream. Epitheliolymphoid tissue, so the lymphoid tissue which is associated with the mucous membrane. So this mostly it is associated with your gastrointestinal tract and your respiratory system. Then you also have this reticuloendothelial system, which I have already mentioned about this one, phagocytic in nature. Okay. What are the characters of lymph vessels? When you look at the lymph vessels, they also start as capillaries. They are called as lymph capillaries. Set of capillaries actually starts. So this is an arteriole, and this is your capillaries of the circulatory system, and this is the venous end of the capillaries. So the fluid from the tissue spaces, whatever is released from here, distributed, the 100% does not reach here, 10 to 20% of it escapes through these lymph capillaries. The lymph capillaries is again lined by endothelium. You don't find any muscular or adventitial coat. The endothelium is also very poorly developed, and the basement membrane upon which the endothelium rests is also poorly developed. But it has got a very high caliber when compared to the venous capillaries of the circulatory system. So that is why large coarser particles can traverse through these capillaries. So they absorb tissue fluid, and because it is a colorless fluid, it is difficult to visualize. Now these lymph capillaries, even though they are present throughout our body, in certain areas they are absent, especially in the brain. You don't have lymphatic vessels or lymph nodes in the spinal cord. So that means in the whole of the central nervous system it is absent. The function of this is taken care of by the cerebrospinal fluid in the central nervous system. It is absent in the bone marrow and articular cartilage. Now we know very well articular cartilage is avascular. So in the same way, cornea, hair and nail is also avascular. There are no blood vessels. They receive their nutrition only through diffusion. So when there is no blood vessels, definitely there is no question of lymphatic capillaries or nodes or lymphatic vessels existing there. So these are some of the places where actually the lymphatics are absent. So here you are able to see that from the systemic circulation, the larger arteries divides into capillaries, and this is the venous end of the capillaries forming venules and large veins. Some of the tissue fluid escapes through the lymphatic capillaries, are actually present in the form of plexus of capillaries. Then they go to the lymph vessels, which are actually called as the lymphatics, and from there they might go to the lymph nodes. And just observe, the lymphatics are also possessed with valves, and ultimately they are actually draining into the venous system. So mainly they drain into the brachiocephalic vein ultimately. In the same way, even for the pulmonary circulation. So the lymphatic capillaries are there through lymph nodes, and ultimately they also come and drain into the venous system. So this is actually the general topography of the lymphatics in our body. Okay. Now we have seen about the capillaries. They have an endothelium, they have high caliber, they actually can drain coarser particles, so of larger molecule size, which cannot pass through the venous system, go through these capillaries. So these capillaries unite to form the lymphatics. So lymphatics can be seen superficially nearer to the surface. They are called as superficial lymphatics, and mostly they will be associated or travel with the veins, whereas the deeper lymphatics are most closely associated or they travel with the arteries. Whatever might be the case, whether it is superficial lymphatics or the deep lymphatics, they actually has to go and relay in lymph nodes. So lymph nodes are places or something called as filters, where the lymph will be filtered. So any foreign body or any microbes might get trapped here when they pass through these lymph nodes. And not only that, these lymph nodes also produce lymphocytes, which is again added to the lymph fluid. So that means the lymphocytes which are produced enters into this lymphatic vessels, and from there they enter into the bloodstream, and it is vice versa. The reverse also takes place. So smaller lymphatics join to form very larger lymphatics, and finally they drain into the venous system. So now we will just see briefly about some of the major lymph vessels which is present in our body. The largest lymph vessel is the thoracic duct, and the other one is actually called as the right lymphatic duct. Hope you remember, I already mentioned it is this vessel we will be able to visualize with our naked eye. Thoracic duct is easily visible. The thoracic duct is mainly responsible almost 80% of our body. The lymph is actually drained ultimately into this thoracic duct. So the areas of drainage include both the lower limbs, your abdomen, that is your body wall below the level of diaphragm, your left half of thorax, left upper limb, left half of your head and neck. So that means these are the areas drained by the thoracic duct, or putting it in other words, you can tell it drains the whole of the body except the right upper limb, right half of your thorax, right half of your head and neck. This right half of head, neck and right upper limb and right half of the thorax is actually drained by the right lymphatic duct. So whether it is the thoracic duct or whether it is the right lymphatic duct, these green color channels which you see on either side ultimately opens into the brachiocephalic vein. So this is the brachiocephalic vein. You are able to see this is the left and the right brachiocephalic veins. Okay. So they open to the brachiocephalic vein at the junction of the internal jugular and subclavian veins. So that means I am again reiterating my point, that is they ultimately pour all the lymph into the venous blood. Then other major lymphatics which you come across in the body are the branches of the thoracic duct. Then you have the jugular lymph trunk which is coming from the neck, which is going to drain your head and neck. Then subclavian lymph trunk, it's a major lymph trunk which is going to drain part of your upper limb and part of your thorax. Then external iliac lymph trunks. Then you have mediastinal lymph trunks. Then cisterna chyli. So this is actually the place from where what happens, the thoracic duct starts. Then you also have lumbar lymph vessels or lumbar lymph trunks, which is given as right and left lumbar lymph trunks. These are some of the major lymphatic vessels which are present in our body. Okay. So we have seen about the lymphatic vessels. So the smallest ones are called as capillaries, same like our circulatory system. Then followed by we have seen about the lymphatics, the common characters of the lymphatics. Then we have seen a few aspects about the major lymph vessels in our body. So at least you should remember the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. Then we have seen about the areas drained by these two large lymphatic channels. Now we will come to the lymphoid tissue, basically central lymphoid tissue, and the other one is going to be the peripheral lymphoid tissue. Central lymphoid tissue is bone marrow. One is the bone marrow, the yellow bone marrow, and other one is the thymus. Remember, this bone marrow is responsible for the production of B lymphocytes. So B lymphocytes are actually produced in the bone marrow. So they actually arise from the hemopoietic stem cells embryologically during development. What happens is from the wall of the yolk sac, these cells actually migrate and they go to many places, not only to the bone marrow, even they go to the liver, they go to the spleen. But in the adults, what happens is ultimately B lymphocytes is restricted, production is restricted only to the bone marrow. If you look at this hemopoietic stem cells, here they are multipotential, that is pluripotent. Pluripotent means they have the capacity to transform themselves or to give rise to many type of cells. One is you are able to see B lymphocytes. Then the other cells, of course, they go on to produce the all types of these leukocytes. You are able to see neutrophil, basophil, eosinophil, monocytes, and of course your RBCs also. Okay. What is B lymphocytes? Now, why it is actually called as B lymphocytes? B stands for bursae fabricae, which is first identified in aves. Aves actually near the chloractal membrane, they have a structure which is actually called as bursae fabricae, from where B lymphocytes are produced. The same nomenclature has been also retained for the humans. Okay. The next, thymus. The lymphocytes which are produced primarily in the thymus, so that is why it is actually called as the T lymphocytes. So you are able to see this is actually the thymus, a bilobed organ which you are able to see in the upper part of your thorax, called as the superior mediastinum. It is very well developed in the infants, adolescents, and once you reach puberty, what happens is it is slowly replaced by fatty tissue. So that means it becomes inactive after a certain period of time. Why? Because the other lymphatic tissue develops and takes charge of it, and naturally what happens is the thymus stops producing T lymphocytes. So how T lymphocytes are produced is the B lymphocytes from the bone marrow during the developmental stages. What happens is it migrates to the thymus, and from there it gets transformed into T lymphocytes. So T stands for thymus, so that is why it is called as T lymphocytes. These T lymphocytes, what happens is 80% of it, they can become autoallergic. That means they might attack the host cells itself. So they are actually degraded and they are seen something as Hazel's corpuscles. The remaining other T lymphocytes, 20% of it only enters into your bloodstream and they form the circulating T lymphocytes. So from there they are distributed to your lymph nodes, spleen and other lymphoid organs, because apart from the thymus you also have T lymphocytes to some extent in the lymph nodes, spleen. Now these T lymphocytes, what happens is they can live for many years. They can withstand many years, they will be circulating inside our bloodstream. They are for mediating the immune responses. They are mainly concerned with the cell-mediated immune response. So they are cytotoxic in nature. They are responsible for the production of cytotoxic cells. So mainly they go and attack the virus, fungi or bacteria. They produce substances which are called as cytokines or lymphokines and cytokines. Now they also have something called as helper cells. So the helper cells are mainly responsible to help the B lymphocytes in their immune response. You also have suppressor cells, TS or T lymphocytes. In that we have another variety. Apart from helper cells, we also have suppressor cells, which is responsible for suppressing the immune response in certain cases. So these T lymphocytes perform many functions. So they are also involved in lymphosis, production of lymphocytes. They can actually modify the action of these B lymphocytes. And our blood mainly consists 80% of these T lymphocytes. So 80% of T lymphocytes are mainly seen in our blood. Coming to the B lymphocytes, the B lymphocytes are also involved in the immune responses. They are mainly concerned with the humoral type of immune response. What is the meaning of humoral type of immune responses? They produce certain proteins which are actually called as antibodies. So when they produce the antibodies, how they produce antibodies is when they get activated. B lymphocytes, they will be circulating. They might be committed, but they might not become active to produce antibodies. When they come across, when an immune reaction is actually necessary, they become enlarged and form plasma cells, and these plasma cells are going to produce antibodies. They are actually humoral related immune response. So mainly they are actually called as immunoglobulins. 5 types of immunoglobulins are recognized: IgM, IgA, IgG, IgD and IgA. Okay. So through this they bring about the immune response, and they are very short-lived, and they are continuously produced from your bone marrow, spleen, lymph nodes and other lymphoid tissues wherever it is present. Okay. So that is the difference between the T lymphocytes and the B lymphocytes. Okay. So central lymphoid tissue we have seen, one is the bone marrow and other one is the thymus. So these are the main source of the lymphocytes of our body. In fetal period, what happens is even the liver also produces, spleen also produces, but later what happens, it is restricted only to the bone marrow. Coming to the peripheral lymphoid tissue, lymph node. You are able to see lymph node. If you look at the structure of the lymph node, it is somewhat reniform shape or kidney shape. It is indented to one end, and that place where you see that indentation is actually called as the hilum. A single lymph node receives many afferent vessels, lymph vessels entering, but through the hilum only one efferent lymph vessels leaves. Only a single efferent lymph vessels leaves through the hilum. And the lymph node is actually covered by a capsule. Deep to the capsule you see a space which is actually called as the subcapsular sinus, which is a characteristic feature of a lymph node. And then you have the cortex, and as you go deeper what you see is the medulla. In the cortex you see lot of aggregation of lymphoid tissue. These are actually called as the lymph follicles. They are arranged in the form of follicles. So the cortex, there are different zones: zone 1, zone 2 and zone 3. Zone 1 you see moderate lymphocytes, macrophages, plasma cells. Second zone you go, you see lot of B lymphocytes, aggregation of lymphocytes. Then you go to parafollicular area, paracortical area or parafollicular area, you again come across T lymphocytes here. Then we have the medulla. If you look at a follicle, at the center it is pale because it is actually called as the germinal center. So in the germinal center is the active site of the lymphocyte production. The lymphocytes are actually dividing from lymphoblasts. They produce lymphocytes, mature lymphocytes. Then they move out and they are present in the subcapsular sinus. From there, what happens to the efferent lymph vessels? They enter into the circulation. Okay, so that is about the structure of a lymph node. So inside the lymph node, you see collection of lymphoid follicles. Each lymphoid follicle has got a germinal center in the center, germinal center which is pale, and it is the site of the active production of lymphocytes, B lymphocytes. The next peripheral lymphoid tissue, largest lymphoid tissue, it is actually called as the spleen. Spleen also can also be considered as a hemolymphoid organ. Mainly consists of this is called as a white pulp, and then as you go, you have the red pulp. The white pulp, same like the lymphatic follicles which we have seen here, is densely populated with the B lymphocytes. So B lymphocytes are actually present here, same like what we have seen in the lymph node. Little bit of T lymphocytes are also you can see. If you go to the medullary part, you will be able to see the red pulp which is called as sinusoids. So mainly you come across splenic sinusoids. So regarding the sinusoids, we have already discussed about what are the sinusoids in the circulatory system. Not only that, the spleen is also involved in the destruction of RBCs in the adults postnatal life, but in the fetus it is the active site of production of RBCs, but here it is actually erythrolysis. Then what happens? It separates the bilirubin from that and heme separately. Bilirubin is sent for the liver. Not only that, platelets and leukocytes are also phagocytosed here, worn out cells. If too much of RBCs are destructed, then the condition you become anemic. When too much of leukocytes or WBCs are actually destructed, then you call it as leukopenia. When the platelets too much are destructed, it is actually called as thrombocytopenia. So mainly this occurs in case of infections. Then the whole spleen gets enlarged, it is called as splenomegaly. Most common thing splenomegaly occurs is during malaria. So it produces both T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes also. So we have seen peripheral lymphoid tissue, one is the lymph node and other one is the spleen. Now we will come to the epitheliolymphoid system, which is related to the epithelial membrane, epithelial layer. Immediately deep to the epithelium, we have this, which is actually mucosa associated lymphoid tissue or MALT. In MALT, you have one thing called as GALT or gut associated lymphoid tissue. The other one is actually called as bronchus associated lymphoid tissue or BALT. Mucosa associated lymphoid tissue in the pharynx, that is a junction of the oral cavity and the pharynx, you see here, is actually called as Waldeus, a ring of lymphoid tissue. The palatine tonsils, the lingual tonsils, the tubal tonsils and the pharyngeal tonsils all form a ring of lymphoid tissue, mainly for trapping the antigens. So for trapping the antigens, this is present. It is actually mucosa associated lymphoid tissue or MALT. Same way in the GIT, you go down in the GIT, you see something called in the ileum, Peyer's patches, collection of lymphoid follicles, they are actually called as Peyer's patches. You see the ileum as well as in the appendix. Then in the respiratory system, you come across the trachea and in the large bronchus, again like this collection of lymphoid follicles, they are actually called as bald or bronchus associated lymphoid follicles. Apart from that, you also have diffuse lymphatic cells along the respiratory, digestive and also along the urinary system. Next, we will go to the reticuloendothelial system. As I had mentioned earlier, that reticuloendothelial system does not strictly fall under the lymphatic system. The only thing is they also elicited some immune response, so that is why we are discussing here macrophage cells. So they are phagocyte in nature. That means what happens, the cell goes near the antigen and tries to digest it. That is actually called as phagocytic nature. They are mainly by the macrophages, that is monocytes, perform this function. Kupffer cells in the liver perform this function. Histiocytes which are present in the connective tissue perform this function. Microglia is in the CNS performs the phagocytic function in the central nervous system. They form the scar tissue. So they are all first line of defense because they go and directly attack the antigens. Specific immune responses they produce, and naturally they are also responsible for absorbing the fat from the intestine to be transported to the blood. So how actually our immune system alters as the age advances? During birth, what happens is they are very prominent, but even though they are prominent, the thymus is prominent and actively producing T lymphocytes, but the other lymphoid tissue are not that much developed. It slowly grows during childhood, but not very effective in case of infants or the neonates. Your immune system, what happens is diminishes with age. This is obvious. You all know that T lymphocytes, they are not produced after some time once you reach puberty. Whatever is being produced at that time only circulates for many years. So why? Is because thymic hormone production is reduced. So thymus actually should modulate this, which is being replaced by fat tissue. The T cells or thymic cells, toxic cells, cytotoxic cells becomes less responsive to antigens. So fewer T cells, naturally responsiveness of B cells also decreases because T cells modulates the B cells indirectly. Immunosurveillance against tumor cells declines. So ultimately what happens? We have increased vulnerability to infections and cancers. So that is why the old people are more prone for infections. Any type of diseases, evenly not for infections, even for cancers, tumor growth, systemic diseases, and so on. Okay, coming finally to the applied aspects of the lymphatic system. Lymphadenitis is inflammation of the lymph nodes. They get swollen and stony hard when it is getting infected. So that is why when we have infections of the respiratory tract, naturally what happens when we go to the physician, he will try to palpate the lymph nodes, especially along the neck, retropharyngeal nodes and so on. Because regional lymph nodes are situated everywhere along the body. So if the regional lymph nodes are involved, then we know which area is getting infected. Like you have inguinal lymph nodes, we have deep cervical nodes, we have parotid nodes, submandibular lymph nodes, jugulodigastric nodes, jugulo-omohyoid nodes. Okay. Hodgkin's lymphoma is actually a type of cancer. So cancers of the lymph node, so mainly seen in case of Hodgkin's lymphoma. Metastasis is the spread of cancer cells. Secondary spread of cancers is actually called as metastasis. So from one organ, how it actually goes to a distant organ is mainly because through these lymph vessels. So as they go through the lymph vessels, naturally all the lymph nodes will be involved. So this knowledge of the lymph nodes helps us to understand the route of spread of infections. Lymphangitis is actually inflammation of the lymph vessels, and filariasis, you all know what is filariasis, or also called as elephantiasis. So you are able to see swelling of especially the lower limbs and the scrotum. That is because it is infected by this called as Wuchereria bancrofti. So this, once it is present, it goes and blocks all your lymph vessels. So when the lymph vessels gets blocked, the tissue fluid gets retained in the tissue spaces, and that is why you get an edematous condition. And they become very active only in the night. So naturally you are going to sample or diagnose, you have to take a sample. Naturally it should be collected only in the nights. So that is about the lymphatic system. Next, in short or brief, we will see about certain aspects of connective tissue also, because we are going to encounter different types of connective tissue. One form of connective tissue we have already described, that is the bone. Okay. So one of the four basic tissues of the body, you all know that epithelial tissue, muscular tissue and nervous tissue. Apart from that, we have connective tissue which accounts for almost all the thing which is present except these three tissues. Okay. So they are your blood cells, your cartilage, your bone and other type of loose connective tissue. They are mainly for support, binding and protection. So that means they are also responsible for producing some reactions in our body in response to some foreign organisms or some anything which is allergic to the body, which the body cannot tolerate. We have cellular components, so you have connective tissue cells, and we also have extracellular components, which is fibers and ground substance. So bone and cartilage is also a very special type of connective tissue, and that all the connective tissue is actually derived from our germ layer, that is the mesoderm is one of the germ layer, the other two being the ectoderm and the endoderm. So the cells of the connective tissue are fibroblasts, adipocytes, macrophages, plasma cells, mast cells and pigment cells. So here I am able to see a fibroblast cell. They are responsible, mainly seen in most types of connective tissues. Ligaments, you come across these fibroblasts, and they also are responsible for production of connective tissue fibers, which we will see in the next slide. Adipocytes are flat cells, you are able to see. It looks like a signet ring. Then plasma cells, you all know what is plasma cells, we have already described, involved in the immune response. Mast cells, and again they are mainly responsible production of certain substances, histamines by the mast cells during allergic reactions, and melanocytes or pigment cells which give color to our skin, iris, hair and all those things. Okay. So cells of the fibroblasts, cells of the connective tissue cells are fibroblasts, adipocytes, macrophages, plasma cells and pigment cells. So the extracellular component is three types of fibers you come across: collagen fiber, elastic fiber and reticulin fiber. So here you are able to see an elastic fiber very thin type of fiber and they show branching. So because of this only you can stretch. We have already seen that in elastic cartilage it is made up of elastic fibers. Even if you distort it, it can come back to its original shape. It can maintain its original shape. Next is collagen fibers. They are thicker. They don't possess that elastic property. They don't stretch very much. To some extent they possess. And reticulin are actually fibers which are interwoven like this. They give skeletal support to certain organs, internal support, and that is why it is called as reticulin. And apart from that, you also have a ground substance. The ground substance is uniform throughout the body. It is a homogeneous ground substance. So the extracellular components especially are fibers. They are the collagen fiber, elastin fiber, and reticulin fiber. Based on the type of the cells and fibers present inside that connective tissue and the density, how thickly, which type of cells or fibers dominate, the connective tissue can be broadly classified into loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. So loose connective tissue, a very good example is the loose areolar tissue, other type being your reticular or adipose tissue. So the cells and the fibers, they are not very thickly populated. You see the fibroblast cells. You are also seeing moderately collagen cells, collagen fibers and elastic fibers. So they are mainly for lubrication. They are mainly present to facilitate movement. So around the joints you can see the bursae. The bursae mainly consist of the loose areolar tissue, that is the bursae around the joint. Dense connective tissue again is of two types, dense regular and dense irregular. Dense regular, you can see the fibers are very much densely packed and they are uniform, running parallel to one another. They don't crisscross or don't run in other directions. So an example of dense regular connective tissue is the tendons. So you see the collagen fibers and you also see the fibroblasts, the cells of the connective tissue. So mainly in tendons you see the collagen fibers, so that means they are not very much elastic in nature. So functions of connective tissue, as I told you, they are mainly for mechanical support, packing material, so that fat is a very good packing material. What happens in certain cavities, for example, your eyeball is present inside the socket orbit. A lot of fat is present so that it does not get affected due to any mechanical injuries. Deep fascia present around the muscles, they form a sleeve, tight sleeve-like muscles. Because of that, the contour of the limbs are maintained, the shape. Otherwise, what happens is the muscle, if they bulge sideways, then naturally what happens is the shape might get altered. Aids in venous return, because in the interfacial spaces you can see the nerves and vessels running. Restraint mechanism, then loose connective tissue. One is superficial fascia, in that you see fat is a genuine content of the superficial fascia. They are involved in injury repair. Fibroblast forms scar tissue, macrophages, phagocyte, this we have already seen. I told you mast cells are mainly responsible in allergic reactions, and antibodies, that also we have discussed in the lymphatic system, which is produced by the plasma cells. So embryonic connective tissue are again pluripotent. They might, or they have the capacity to get transformed into various types of connective tissue. So one type of connective tissue which we see here is the ligaments. Mainly helps to binding the bones together, especially in fibrous joints. We have seen these ligaments present around the joints. They are tough but flexible, so that means they can be bent. They are not strong like board. They can be bent to some extent, mainly made up of collagen fibers, predominantly collagen fibers. In certain ligaments only, the elastic fiber is actually very prominent, and that is the ligament of flava. which you see between the first vertebra, and in the ear ossicles, the ligaments which hold the ear ossicles together, they are more of elastic fibers. Apart from that, all the ligaments in our body, mostly they are predominantly collagen in nature. So the ligaments are mainly, when they are present near the joints, they are called as intrinsic. When they are away from the joint, they are called as extrinsic. Some ligaments are tendons which have degenerated slowly and they form a ligament. To some extent, they maintain stability to the joint and they have the nerve supply same as the joints. So ligaments mainly helps the bones together. They provide stability to the joints. Predominantly collagen fibers. Intrinsic and extrinsic ligaments, two types are there, and ligaments are actually a type of connective tissue. So today we have actually discussed about the lymphatic system and we have also discussed about certain aspects of the connective tissue. So thank you very much for patient listening, and we will meet again in one more topic in short.